More than 2 million people die every year from infections no drug on the market can stop. And growing in the cracks of your sidewalk, choking your flower beds, hiding under your own lawnmower blades, there are plants capable of something extraordinary. Not folklore, not guesswork. Documented, peer-reviewed research shows these weeds can suppress bacterial strains that have made our most powerful pharmaceuticals irrelevant. The same plants, ancient texts, including the Bible, once described as sacred and life-saving, thousands of years before anyone had ever heard the word antibiotic. And every year, Americans spend more than $2 billion trying to wipe them out. Today, that stops. We're counting down 10 of these weeds, plants growing within 20 feet of your own front door right now, ranked from impressive to genuinely hard to believe. Stay until number 1. It survives frost. It survives drought. It survives every chemical we throw at it. The Anglo-Saxons believed it could defeat death itself. They may have been onto something. Number 10. Self-heal Prunella vulgaris. Have you ever looked down at your lawn and noticed small purple flowers pushing up through the grass you mow without a second thought? Nobody bothered giving this plant a poetic name or a Latin nickname that needed explaining. They just called it exactly what it does. Self-heal. Medieval surgeons had a name for it too. Carpenter's herb. On timber yards, where blades slipped and splinters turned septic, this was the first thing pressed onto the wound. An ocean away, the Iroquois used it for infected throat ulcers. In China, it earned its own formal name. In traditional medicine, Xia Ku Chao, prescribed specifically for bacterial infections of the throat and glands. 3 cultures, 3 continents, no contact with each other. Some plante, some conclusion. Coincidence? Modern chemistry says probably not. Self-heal carries rosmarinic acid, the same antimicrobial compound found in rosemary and lemon balm, active against oral and respiratory pathogens. But there's something else in this plant. Almost nobody talks about a polysaccharide called prunellin. Early research suggests it may stop certain bacteria from ever attaching to your mucosal tissue in the first place. Not treating the infection, preventing it from starting. Steep a tablespoon of fresh leaves and flowers in water, just off the boil. 7 minutes. Then strain. Bitter, herbal, softened with a little honey. Drink it the second your throat feels wrong. Next on this list, grows in exactly the soil every gardener complains about, and it's sour enough to make your mouth pucker. What's hiding inside it might surprise you more than anything we've covered so far. Number 9. Sheep sorrel, Rumex acetosella. Ever notice the patches of lawn where nothing seems to grow properly? Thin, poor, acidic soil that every gardener fights against? That's exactly where sheep sorrel chooses to thrive, on purpose. Its leaves are small and arrow-shaped, almost prehistoric looking, and if you've ever chewed one out of curiosity, you already know the taste. Sharp, sour, almost electric, like concentrated lemon. That bite comes from oxalic acid and a group of compounds called anthraquinone glycosides. 2 of those anthraquinones, crisophanol and imodin, have been studied for antibacterial activity, especially against gut pathogens. But here's what almost nobody, not even most herbalists, knows about this worthless lawn weed. It also carries high concentrations of flavonoids, called vitexin and isovitexin, compounds researchers have examined for activity against Helicobacter pylori. the exact bacterium behind most stomach ulcers. These same molecules show up in some of the most expensive specialty teas in the world and in passion flower vine. Here, they're growing for free, right under your feet. Algonquin communities used sheep sorrel for digestive infections and fevers. European folk medicine reached for it as a cooling herb during inflammation. Even nutritionally, a scant teaspoon of the dried leaf carries measurable iron and vitamin C. One catch. That same oxalic acid means this isn't a plant for daily, high-volume use. A few leaves in a salad or a small infusion, no more than a cup a day. Used occasionally and deliberately, the chemistry backs up what multiple, unconnected traditions already believed. Its cousin, next on this list, looks almost identical from a distance, but it closes its leaves at night like it's falling asleep, and it hides a completely different kind of medicine. One you don't drink. You apply it. Number 8. Wood sorrel, Oxalis acetosella. Have you ever pulled a plant simply because it didn't belong in your garden bed, even though, if you're honest, you thought it was kind of pretty? That's the fate of wood sorrel. Small, clover-shaped, growing in cool, damp shade, its leaves folding shut at night as if falling asleep. The Celts didn't see a weed. They saw 3 petals and the Holy Trinity sacred enough to build symbolism around. Centuries later, Irish monks, carrying medical knowledge through wars and upheaval, included wood sorrel in their wound-washing formulas. That wasn't superstition. It was tannins enough, a stringent tannin content, to make the plant genuinely effective as a wound wash plus a solid dose of vitamin C, historically used to prevent scurvy in communities with no access to citrus. Here's the detail that separates a real remedy from just another wild salad green. Heat destroys the tannins, so don't boil this one. Crush a handful of fresh leaves, press the juice straight into a clean cloth, and apply it directly to the wound. Cold extraction only. The juice runs pale green, faintly viscous, sharply sour. Eaten fresh in a salad, it tastes like lemon with a clean, cool finish, and unlike its sheep sorrel cousin, you can eat this one in moderate amounts without a second thought. Next on this list, we leave the sour plants behind for something almost nobody looks at twice until they hear exactly what it's capable of. Number 7. Plantain, Plantago, Major Plantago lanceolata. Have you ever driven straight over a plant growing through the cracks in your own driveway without ever wondering what it actually does? Broadleaf plantain and its narrow-leafed cousin don't just survive that kind of abuse, they seem to prefer it. Compacted soil, gravel, the most neglected corner of every lawn in the temperate world. That's home to them. Medieval healers called it the bandage of God. That wasn't poetry. It was a diagnosis. The Book of Psalms speaks of the land itself yielding healing herbs, and plantain shows up exactly where that promise gets tested. In the Leech Book of Bald, a 9th century English medical text prescribed for infected wounds, snake bites, festering ulcers. Thousands of miles away, with zero contact with Anglo-Saxon healers, the Cherokee, the Mohegan, and the Iroquois all reached the same conclusion about the same plant. Here's what happens when you actually crush a leaf. Breaking the cell walls sets off a chemical chain reaction. A compound called aucubin converts into cattle-pole, and cattle-pole goes to work directly against Staphylococcus aureus, including methicillin-resistant strains. The Cherokee never had a lab. They had thousands of years of paying close attention. Science is only now catching up. There's a second compound here too, allantoin, which stimulates cell growth and wound healing. It's the active ingredient in wound cream, and it's also free, growing through the crack in your driveway right now. Crush a fresh leaf, press it onto a cut or a sting, and you'll feel it cool the skin within minutes. For something gentler, cold steep a handful of leaves in water overnight and drink it in the morning, quiet, green, almost forgettable in flavor. The healing is not. Next up is a plant so hated. Americans spend $500 million a year trying to kill it. Hippocrates would have found that baffling. Number 6. Dandelion, Taraxacum officinale. What if the plant you're digging out of your lawn every Saturday morning is the same one Hippocrates prescribed to his own patients? Dandelion is, by a wide margin, the most despised plant in North American lawn culture, hated enough that the global market for products designed to kill it tops $500 million a year. Sit with that number. $500 million spent annually to erase a plant that Persian physicians in the 10th century used specifically for liver and bile conditions, and that stayed in China's official imperial pharmacopoeia for over 1,000 years. The Book of Numbers describes the Israelites eating bitter herbs in the wilderness. Bitterness treated not as a flaw, but as part of the cure. Dandelion follows the same logic. Its bitterness is the whole point. Compounds called taraxacin and taraxacerin stimulate bile and liver activity, addressing exactly the kind of internal stagnation ancient healers watched for. Modern research adds a second layer. Taraxacin shows inhibitory activity against gram-positive bacteria linked to internal abscesses. The root itself is packed with inulin, a prebiotic fiber that feeds the gut bacteria responsible for producing compounds, now considered central to intestinal immunity. Roast the root, and everything changes. Smoke, earth, a bitterness that edges toward dark chocolate. The French have been drinking it for centuries as café de pissenlit. During the Second World War, when antibiotics were rationed across occupied Europe, nurses turned to dandelion preparations too, never as a replacement for penicillin. They were careful about that, but as a bridge, something with real antimicrobial power when nothing else was available. Simmer a tablespoon of chopped root in 2 cups of water for 20 minutes. Gentle, never a hard boil, or you lose the volatile compounds. What's left is dark, bitter, deeply earthy. Next, a plant so ordinary in the rest of the world that 5 continents have been eating it for 3,000 years. Only in America do we spray it dead on sight. Number 5. Purslane portulaja oleracea. Low, fleshy, and quick to spread across garden beds after a summer rain. Why would a plant like this, one that's fed 5 continents for 3,000 years, be treated as garden trash in exactly one country? Greeks fold it into fattoush. Turks cook it into yogurt. As semizotu. Mexicans braise it with chili and pork and call it verdolagas. Across the Middle East, it's been eaten continuously since before recorded agriculture. The United States is one of the only food cultures on Earth that reaches for a spray bottle instead of a fork. Here's why that might be a mistake. Purslane contains EPA, the marine type omega-3 fatty acid usually associated with oily fish, at concentrations almost unheard of in a land plant. Most plant-based omega-3 sources only offer ALA, a form your body has to convert first. Purslane skips that step entirely. But the real story here is biofilms, the protective shields, bacteria build around themselves to survive antibiotics. A bacterium hiding inside a biofilm can shrug off doses hundreds of times stronger than what would kill it alone. Purslane's stems and leaves carry mucilaginous polysaccharides, that distinctive sliminess you feel chewing it raw, and early research suggests these compounds interfere with the signals and bacteria use to build those biofilms in the first place. The research is young, but if it holds up, it's a genuinely new weapon against one of medicine's hardest problems. Eat it raw for a pleasant saltiness and a crunch close to young cucumber, or saute it briefly with garlic, olive oil, and lemon until it turns silky. Never cook it past 2 or 3 minutes, or you lose both the omega-3s and the polysaccharides that make it worth eating. Harvest mid-morning once the dew has dried. It freezes well if blanched quickly. Number 4. Chickweed, Stellaria media. What happens to nature's medicine cabinet when frost sets in and the ground turns hard as stone? Most plants that heal us simply go dormant, waiting out the cold. Chickweed refuses. It germinates in autumn as everything else is dying, keeps growing under a layer of snow, and by February, it's often the only living green thing left in the entire garden. Those small, star-shaped white flowers and tender, water-filled stems aren't just stubborn, they're active. Chickweed carries antimicrobial compounds effective against Candida fungi and gram-negative bacteria, including the E. coli strains behind most urinary tract infections. The agents responsible are saponins and a flavonoid called rutin, the same compound studied in other respected medicinal plants for its anti-inflammatory and antimicrobial properties. Rub the leaves between your fingers and you'll feel it. A faint, soapy slickness from the saponins themselves. In Appalachia, they called it poor man's medicine. The whole fresh plant, crushed and mixed with a small amount of rendered lard, became a paste pressed onto abscesses, boils, infected wounds, the lard simply holding the active compounds against the skin far longer than water ever could. One detail most sources skip. Chickweed saponins are water-soluble, but surprisingly heat-sensitive. For topical use, keep it fresh or warm the plant material in oil at no more than 40 degrees Celsius for 6 to 8 hours. For drinking, a cold water infusion left overnight pulls out far more of the saponins than a hot tea ever would. The taste itself is disarming for a medicinal plant, sweet, tender, almost like the first bite of a very young ear of corn. Harvest before the flowers fade. Once pollination sets in, the stems toughen and the saponins turn bitter. A window sometimes as short as 2 or 3 weeks, in late autumn and again in earliest spring. If the idea that one plant simply refuses to stop working, even in the dead of winter, is the kind of thing that keeps you watching, this is exactly the kind of ancient knowledge this channel exists for. Hit like, subscribe, and stay close, because the next plant on this list doesn't just survive. It fights back the moment you touch it. Number 3. Stinging nettle, Urtica dioica. Ever brushed against a plant and regretted it half a second later? Stinging nettle is covered in microscopic, silica-tipped needles that inject a mix of histamine and formic acid on contact. The burn is immediate, red, and can last for hours. It's a defense mechanism so effective that insects avoid it, grazing animals avoid it, and most gardeners, after one encounter, reach for thick gloves and a bottle of herbicide. Here's what they're erasing without knowing it. Nettle root contains a lectin protein called UDA, urtica dioica, agglutinin, that binds directly to the cell membranes of drug-resistant gram-positive bacteria and disrupts them. It doesn't work like a blunt chemical attack. It targets specific proteins on the bacteria's outer surface. European research has flagged this as a potentially significant mechanism because when the target is external like this, the usual pathways bacteria use to build resistance simply don't apply. The Hebrew word serpad, translated as nettle or thorns, marks the desolate places in Scripture where healing has been abandoned, which tells you something. This plant was familiar enough in the ancient Near East that its presence, or its absence, meant something. The Romans didn't just tolerate nettle in Britain. Records show they carried its seeds there deliberately, planting it as both food and medicine. Roman soldiers rubbed the leaves directly onto arthritic joints, a practice called urtication that modern physiotherapy has actually revisited, finding the injected compounds do temporarily ease pain through a plausible mechanism. Fast forward to World War I. When British cotton supplies ran short, the German military wove nettle fibers into wound dressings instead, stronger and more durable than cotton. What those soldiers never knew is that the fibers were quietly releasing small amounts of UDA and formic acid directly into the wound itself. A passive antiseptic woven into the bandage. 30 seconds in boiling water destroys the sting completely. What's left tastes like spinach, but deeper, earthier, more mineral, with a faint marine note. Italians turn it into risotto alla ortica. The Irish simmer it into a soup with potato, onion, and cream. Blanch only the top 4 to 6 young leaves, picked before flowering, in well-salted water. Gram for gram, it carries more iron than spinach, along with real calcium and vitamin K. As a root tea, 1 teaspoon of chopped dried root simmered in 2 cups of water for 15 minutes. European herbal medicine has long used it for prostate support and seasonal allergies. Something worth raising, with a qualified practitioner, if you're curious. The next plant on this list doesn't just have a use. It has a name borrowed from a legendary warrior who reportedly saved his own soldiers' lives with it. Number 2. Yarrow achillea, millefolium. There's a scene that keeps repeating throughout human history, across civilizations that had no contact with one another at all. A man is wounded deep, bleeding, packed with the dirt of battle. And someone nearby, a healer, a fellow soldier, reaches for the same plant every time. Feathery leaves, flat clusters of white flowers, a scent like wild sage crossed with warm camphor. Achillea millefolium. The name alone tells the story. Achillea comes directly from Achilles, and Homer records that Achilles used this plant to treat his soldiers' wounds, stopping the bleeding and preventing the infections that killed as many men as enemy blades did. Classical writers simply called it herba militaris, the soldier's herb. But it wasn't only the Greeks. The Chinese wove it into the I Ching as a sacred divination plant and into the Shen Nong Ben Caojing, one of the oldest medical texts in the world. The Navajo used it. The Norse used it. The Ojibwe used it. Ask why so many unconnected traditions landed on the exact same plant, and the answer might not be coincidence at all. In 2018, researchers at the University of Thrace in Greece tested yarrow essential oil against MRSA methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus in laboratory conditions. The results held up against vancomycin, one of the last resort drugs for MRSA infections. No single compound explains it. It's a combination: the sesquiterpene lactonachillin, the flavonoid apigenin, and a handful of lesser-studied Borneol derivatives working together, which is exactly why isolated extracts tend to underperform whole plant preparations in the research. But here's the part that makes yarrow genuinely strange. Alongside its antibacterial activity, researchers have documented something else. Yarrow appears to activate macrophages, the white blood cells responsible for hunting down bacteria throughout your entire body. It may not just be killing bacteria on contact. It may be arming your own immune system to finish the job. If that holds up under further study, it isn't behaving like a normal antibiotic at all. There's a passage in the book of Ezekiel describing the prophet lying on his side for days, kept alive on barley bread, water, and what most translations simply call grains and legumes. Scholars of ancient Levantine plant medicine have pointed out that a compound cake like that almost certainly included wild aromatic herbs gathered from the same fields, plants like yarrow. In that world, food and medicine were never really two separate things. To prepare it, steep 2 teaspoons of dried flowers and leaves in a cup of water just off the boil, covered, for 10 to 12 minutes covered, so the volatile compounds don't escape with the steam. The taste is bold, bitter, aromatic, camphor lingering at the back of the palate. In Sweden, yarrow flowers were traditionally mixed with honey and a touch of grain alcohol into rolliga, a digestive tonic taken after dinner for centuries. Drink it at the first sign of fever, in the morning, before eating. Achilles wasn't waiting on a clinical trial. And what's coming next, at number 1, is the plant. This entire story started with number 1, Creeping Charlie, Glechoma hederaceae. You already know this plant, even if you've never learnt its name. Small, scalloped, kidney-shaped leaves, creeping low along the ground, rooting themselves at every point they touch. Shade or sun, dry soil or clay, the thin cracks between paving stones. It doesn't just tolerate those conditions, it thrives in them. Spray it with herbicide, and it retreats for a while. Then it comes back. It has been coming back for over 1,000 years. The Anglo-Saxons called it alehoof, and that name matters because Anglo-Saxons weren't a poetic people. They named things for exactly what those things did. Alehoof clarified and preserved ale. Long before hops became the standard across all of Northern Europe, brewers reached for Creeping Charlie. Instead, a practice German records confirm as far back as the 10th century. Every person who drank that ale was swallowing, without ever knowing it, one of the most potent antibacterial compounds in the entire European plant pharmacopoeia. The compounds responsible are glecomannan, a specific polysaccharide, and ursolic acid, the same waxy compound found on apple skins and rosemary leaves, but concentrated here with unusual density. Ursolic acid has been studied for its activity against anaerobic bacteria, the kind that thrive without oxygen, buried deep in dead tissue, in wounds too deep for air to reach exactly where conventional antibiotics, which generally rely on oxygen-dependent bacterial metabolism, tend to struggle most, which is precisely where Anglo-Saxon healers reached for it. Necrotic wounds, ulcers that refused to close, flesh that had already begun to die. Not a coincidence. And there's a second layer to what it does. Ursolic acid also appears to stimulate new capillary growth, healthy blood vessels pushing into damaged tissue to begin repair. The old healers had a phrase for this dual action: the plant that drives out poison and calls back life. What modern chemistry is now describing lines up with that phrase with an accuracy that's hard to write off as coincidence. There's a passage in Ezekiel describing a valley of dry bones, receiving new flesh, restoration so complete that even what seemed lost beyond hope returns. That idea, healing as reconstruction rather than simple attack, runs through nearly all of ancient medicine. Creeping Charlie seems to have understood it long before anyone had a word for cellular regeneration. To prepare it, gather fresh leaves and young stems in spring or early autumn, when ursolic acid concentration peaks before summer heat pulls the plant's energy toward reproduction. Instead, steep a tablespoon of torn fresh leaves in warm water, around 70 degrees Celsius, never boiling. Boiling degrades the more delicate polysaccharides covered for 8 minutes. The flavor is unlike anything else on this list. Mint and sage sit in the same plant family, and you can taste that kinship, but ground ivy adds something deeper, resinous, almost like a forest floor after rain. Bitter at first, then faintly sweet, with a finish that lingers. For wounds and skin infections, a cold infusion steeped overnight in cold water makes a genuinely effective wash, preserving both the ursolic acid and the polysaccharides far better than heat ever could. This plant doesn't need you to water it, feed it, or protect it. It's already survived 1,000 years of being pulled, sprayed, and cursed at. It only needs one thing from you now. Stop killing it. One more thing, before you look at your lawn differently forever. Everything we've covered today comes with a catch. The plant is only half the story. How you treat it decides whether that power ever actually reaches you. These compounds don't survive everything. Heat breaks them down. Ultraviolet light breaks them down. So does the kind of industrial processing that turns a living plant into a shelf-stable powder in a jar. Aucubin, the real engine behind plantain, starts degrading within hours once it's heated past 85 degrees Celsius. The EPA in purslane oxidizes fast under high heat drying. UDA, nettle's key lectin, denatures above 60 degrees Celsius, exactly why traditional preparations were always cold processed or taken as a tincture, never boiled. And ursolic acid, the compound behind everything Creeping Charlie does, is fat-soluble, not water-soluble. A simple water infusion only ever captures a fraction of what's there. The Anglo-Saxons brewed it in alcohol and fat instead. Nobody explained the chemistry to them. They just knew, from centuries of repetition, what worked. Which raises a harder question than anything else in this video. What if the plants were never what we lost? What if what we actually lost is the knowledge of how to prepare them? Somewhere in the last century, a researcher tested a traditional remedy, found nothing, and quietly filed it under folklore, never realizing the boiling water or the high heat dryer had already destroyed the one compound they were looking for. The plants survived frost, drought, 100 years of herbicide. They're still out there right now, exactly as strong as they've always been. It's the knowledge of how to use them that turned out to be the fragile part. So, if that question stays with you, if the relationship between ancient wisdom and modern science strikes you as more complicated and more interesting than most people assume, this is where you hit like and subscribe. Send this to whoever you know still spends every Saturday morning at war with their own lawn. They deserve to know what they're killing. And tell me in the comments, which one of these 10 is already growing in your yard right now? I genuinely want to know.